On today's episode of Locked On Wild, the Minnesota Wild put Jake Middleton on LTIR, but they also claim a defenseman. We'll tell you who and what it means for the rest of the Wild defense.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day. And we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll break down the news today. Jake Middleton to long-term injured reserve. We'll talk about the addition of Travis Dermott, what he brings to the Minnesota Wild decor, and why the Wild went out and got somebody to replace Jake Middleton. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild and host of the show since 2021, credentialed media member. Busy news day for the Minnesota Wild today as we figured that it was not great considering that Middleton got hurt 37 seconds into the game against the Oilers, was already ruled out by the time the game, I think he was ruled out by the time the second period even started. And now today, officially placed on long-term injured reserve. And from what John Hines said after the game and what he said today, it is an injury that is going to likely require surgery. You can pretty much connect the dots. We saw what happened. Middleton got hit in the hand by a shot. Immediately went down the tunnel into the training room. So it is some sort of broken hand or bone in a hand that is going to sideline Jake Middleton. I want to clarify, because I know this is something that is just confusing to have to keep track of. What's the difference between injured reserve and long-term injured reserve? So by putting Jake Middleton on long-term injured reserve, that means that he is going to miss at least 10 games and at least 24 days of the season going forward. So he's not going to miss a short amount of time. And I think it was Michael Russo went ahead and did the heavy lifting by looking ahead as to how far out Middleton would miss. Tweeting earlier today, not saying it's realistic Jake Middleton could even play by then, but the soonest he is eligible to return is January 7th versus St. Louis. Long-term injured reserve is 10 games and 24 days. So because of the days, Middleton isn't eligible to return until 12 games from now. So you have to hit both thresholds. And so unfortunately, in this case, the 10-game mark does not occur in 24 days. So it's going to be at least 12 games for Jake Middleton. But if you go on a timetable for a broken hand or a bone in a hand, that's going to be very, very low end for the amount of time that he misses. And it comes at a really unfortunate time for the Minnesota Wild because let's just look at where Jake Middleton ranks in the NHL in a couple of key categories. Start with shot blocks. What ended up causing the injury? Middleton is currently 6th in the entire NHL with shot blocks at 76. And he is just 10 behind Chris Tanev, who leads the entirety of the NHL. So you have roughly 3 blocked shots per game that you're going to have to try to offset. Not only that, but he has been part of the best statistical defensive pairing in the entire NHL. Jake Middleton and Brock Faber have played 417 minutes together. 29 games, they have been responsible for 23 goals for and just 8 goals against. That is roughly 1.15 goals against per 60 minutes, which leads the entirety of the NHL with a minimum of 300-ish minutes played. Even if we back it up to, say, 250, I believe they still lead. We'll see if Money Puck actually, even if you back it up to 200 minutes per, they are third in the NHL in terms of goals against. But it feels like those key contributing D pairings have about 300 to 400 minutes together at this point in the season. So they're number one in the regular defensive pairings in terms of goals against per 60 minutes. And their goals for per 60 minutes is 8th. So you are getting both offense and defense when that pairing is on the ice. So I talked about it last night in the postcast. And this is going to kind of contradict what I said regarding being able to replace one player in the lineup, but not necessarily. Because when Jonas Brodin went down, we said that you can probably get by with missing one of your top defensemen because Declan Chisholm stepped in and him and Jared Spurgeon somehow were statistically better. Now, over the course of a long term, probably not going to be the case because I think we would all agree that Jonas Brodin is a far better defenseman than Declan Chisholm. But the point being, you can spread out the duties of one defenseman amongst 6 if it's not your top guy. Jake Middleton, far and away, the best defenseman for the Minnesota Wild this season. That's not even mildly a hot take because of all the different things that he brought to the table. Some of it translates to on ice. Some of it is just his stature. So let's look at the things that he brings. We talked about blocked shots. 6th in the league in blocked shots. So you're going to have to find a way to disperse 3 blocked shots per game in the interim. Now that might be a little easier to do. But what you can't replace that size because, as we'll talk about with new Wild defenseman Travis Dermott, he doesn't bring it. So you can't replace that size. You can't, I don't think, replace the on-ice defense that he was bringing because Middleton has always been kind of a play physical / hit first defenseman, block a ton of shots. This year, his hit numbers are down because he is playing more defense than he has in previous seasons. So that is going to be the biggest area that the Wild have to try to replace is the defense that he was playing so far this season. It was far and away the best that he has played throughout the course of his career. Like if we look at the point shares so far this season, Jake Middleton has 4.6 defensive point shares already. So he has been worth roughly 3 games, roughly 3 games just on his defense alone. That is 0.3 away from the highest mark he has ever had. And he did that in 2022-2023 in 79 games. He has already hit 4.6 defensive point shares in 29 games this season. And if you want to go even a step further than that, let's look at where that ranks amongst Minnesota Wild defensemen so far this season. Because, as you will not be shocked to learn, it is near the top of the list. 4.6 defensive point shares leads the team. 0.1 ahead of Brock Faber. Those are the only two Wild players that are above 4. Jared Spurgeon checks in at 2.8. Jonas Brodin's at 2.6. Zach Bogosian is at 2.5. Kirill Kaprizov's at 2.3. And then Declan Chisholm at 1.9 are the top 7 in that regard. So you're losing your top defenseman, top defensive player in terms of point shares. This is a big loss for the Minnesota Wild. And not only that, but Jake Middleton bringing his 5 goals to the table, which ranked 6th on the team. His 13 points were tied with Joel Eriksson Ek for 7th and Marcus Johansson. Tied with them for 7th on the team. His plus-minus at plus 22 led the team. So he is roughly 1 goal better per game so far this season in the plus column. Still physical, 42 hits in 29 games. So it's not like he has completely abandoned the physical play, but he just has been much more active in the defensive side of things than in previous seasons. So no matter how you slice it, massive loss for the Minnesota Wild. And it's one that is going to, this was not to say that the others aren't, but this is one that is going to be felt by this Minnesota Wild team over the next couple of weeks. Now, the Wild did make a move to bring another defenseman into the room. We'll tell you why they went outside the organization rather than in as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Indeed. We are driven by the search for better. When it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we will have you covered for tomorrow and Sunday's games with postcasts. Since they are earlier in the day, we can actually do postcasts for you. So looking forward to getting the opportunity to see how this Minnesota Wild team bounces back against Philly tomorrow and Vegas on Sunday. Let's get back to the defensive conversation because as we saw against the Edmonton Oilers, once Jake Middleton left the game, the defense was a mess. But there's more to that than simply losing a good player in Jake Middleton. All of a sudden, the Minnesota Wild are now short 2 left shot defensemen. You got Jared Spurgeon, Zach Bogosian, Brock Faber, all right shot defensemen. Declan Chisholm, John Merrill, both left shot defensemen. And so throughout the course of the night, once Middleton left, The Wild all of a sudden found themselves down a left shot defenseman and had to play players out of position to try to just get through the game. And it was a mess. It was a disaster. And look, I understand those circumstances. It's not going to be pretty. But it brings up, I think, one thing that is worth noting about the state of the current Wild defense core for this team. Damon Hunt was a left shot defenseman. You bring in David Jiricek. He is a right shot defenseman, which is something that the organization is going to need going forward. I'm not questioning that aspect of it because it is a need. They only have, at this point, they've got Kyle Masters, David Spacek, Joseph Ciccone, and David Jiricek in the farm system. Cameron Crotty is a right shot defenseman too, but he's currently with the Minnesota Wild as like a seventh defenseman. You don't have a glut of right shot defensemen in this organization. So the move to go get one is something that down the road could pay big dividends. But we have seen this in some of these situations in which Bill Guerin goes out and makes a move, and it ends up, and nobody could have seen this coming. So I'm not trying to like criticize the trade post trade because nobody could have seen this type of situation coming. But Damon Hunt would have been the guy to get called up in that instance. You need a left shot defenseman to come up. Damon Hunt would have been the closest to being ready to go for that opportunity. So now that he is not in the organization, the Wild were left scrambling, and they claim Travis Dermott off waivers from the Edmonton Oilers. He had to fly back to Edmonton, and once he was claimed, he had to fly back. So that's a fun amount of travel, I'm sure, for Travis Dermott to get back to Minnesota to be now part of this organization. What does he bring to the table? Well, he is 28. He's in his age 28 season. He will turn 28 on December 22nd. 6 foot and 200 pounds. So not a few inches shorter and a few pounds lighter than Middleton. But he is a left shot defenseman. He currently has no points, is a -3, and has 3 shots on goal in 10 games, playing about 13 minutes a night. He has bounced around Toronto, Vancouver, Arizona, Edmonton, and his high point total so far in his career occurred at his age 22 season when he had 17 points. 1 or 2 goals. That's about it. He did have 100 hits in his age 22 season and blocked 57 shots in 64 games. This is an NHL-capable defenseman, but a back of the rotation defenseman. He's going to end up being a third pairing guy. This is a low-cost move for the Minnesota Wild out of absolute necessity. Now, you may find yourself asking, why the bleep did Jiricek not get the call? Or why did the Minnesota Wild not call up Carson Lambos or Ryan O'Rourke? Well, as I've made an emphasis point on over the last few weeks, the Minnesota Wild do not view these guys as ready. That's why they're not getting called up. And you can agree with that or disagree with that, but that's the reality of the situation. If the Minnesota Wild thought that Carson Lambos would be able to fill a top 4 role on this defense, he would be here. And the fact that they went out and grabbed Travis Dermott off of waivers should tell you where the organization thinks most of that D-core is sitting. Now, if there's another injury to a right shot defenseman, you're probably going to see David Jiricek get the call up because there aren't a ton left that can stand in the way of these guys. If you sustain another injury, and guess what? I'm not trying to jinx it. Jared Spurgeon has had a pretty decorated injury history. He has already missed a few games this season. He's been fantastic since he came back. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to undersell that. But those wondering why we are not getting a chance to see David Jiricek in this moment, that is my guess as to why. And the reason I keep trying to throw disclaimers in here is because, like I said in the postgame last night, I don't have Billy's ear for roster decisions. So I'm trying to go with more of a react to what happens as opposed to publicly campaign for particular things to happen. If the Wild don't think particular players are ready to take opportunities at the NHL level, so be it. If the Wild thought that any of those defensive prospects were ready to fill in for Jake Middleton in this spot, they would go that route. So, Travis Dermott it is. Now, I will say, granted, what I'm about to say, this is a waiver claim as opposed to a trade. It was a similar reaction when Jake Middleton was first acquired, as we have gotten with Travis Dermott so far. Middleton just hadn't really caught on with the San Jose Sharks yet. The most games he had played in a season before he got traded to Minnesota was 66. And that was his age 26 season. Now, his numbers, better than where Travis Dermott is at in his career thus far. But Dermott has 339 games under his belt and has 16 goals, 62 points. His 82-game average is 4 goals, 15 points, 95 hits, 76 blocks. Similar numbers to Jake Middleton. So I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see if Dermott can provide anything of value to a Minnesota Wild team that is desperately seeking bodies on defense. But if I were to have to guess as to how this is going to go, probably a pretty good reason that Edmonton put him on waivers. So time will tell. Time will tell. But it sounds like they're going to try to get Travis Dermott into the lineup for tomorrow's game against Philly, if they can get the work visa situation ironed out before the game. Guerin is on it, as he told the media in the press conference breaking this down. And the fact that Edmonton was at the Xcel Energy Center last night, Billy was able to just walk over to his box and just say, "Hey, you're gonna put Dermott on waivers. What can you tell me about him?" And it looks like he's going to fit right in from a clubhouse perspective, but that's secondary. That's secondary. The reason that we are bringing him in is to fill a role on this defense. If he does that, then this is going to get thumbs up. If he doesn't, then this defense is going to look like a defense missing 2 of its top defenders until at least one of them comes back. And speaking of, we'll take a look at injury updates for the 3 key Wild players out of the lineup. And we'll also look at what the defensive pairings could look like for the Minnesota Wild going forward. We'll talk about all of that as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. Make your holidays bigger and brighter with Prize Picks, the best place to get real money action while watching your favorite sports. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Join now because this holiday season, Prize Picks is giving away 2 free picks in December, and they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Pixmas. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, a reminder, we got you covered this weekend with postcasts after the Philadelphia Flyers and Vegas Golden Knights games this weekend. So make sure to join us for those as we see how the Wild react to the debacle at the X last night. Just to finish up the defensive conversation here today, what are the defensive pairings going to look like now that Jonas Brodin and Jake Middleton are out of the lineup? Well, first off, Matt Zuccarello and Jonas Brodin both skated again before and during practice. As Michael Russo tweeted out, he said Middleton is week to week. Hasn't talked with Brodin or Zuccarello yet. They're still on the ice to see how they're feeling and whether they can return tomorrow, Sunday, or Wednesday, etc. Obviously, they have to get cleared medically first as well. So the fact that the Minnesota Wild are getting close to the point that they are looking at activating Matt Zuccarello off of long-term injured reserve is an encouraging sign that at least one of those roster spots could potentially open up here before too long. The fact that Brodin is skating, I'm going to take as an encouraging sign that he is closer. He is close to being able to return, and the Wild could definitely use him because guess which other defensive pairing was pretty good when paired together? Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin. And the Wild could use that D pairing right about now. But until Brodin comes back, you're currently sitting with Jared Spurgeon, Zach Bogosian, John Merrill, Declan Chisholm, Brock Faber, Travis Dermott, and Cameron Crotty. The starters are going to be Spurgeon, Bogosian, Merrill, Chisholm, Faber, and Dermott. So how do you iron this out? Well, I think we will probably see. So what we could see is Spurgeon and Chisholm, because that pairing has been pretty good together. So you could keep that continuity together, but then that means you are putting likely John Merrill with Brock Faber. Or you could potentially throw Travis Dermott into the fire right away and pair him with Faber since he's younger and keep the third pairing intact with Merrill and Bogosian. On one hand of the coin, do you value the continuity with the lines you have currently? Do you want to try to keep some of that together? Or do you want to disperse the responsibility a little more evenly between these pairings? Because if you don't really care about the continuity and you want to just try to, make these three as playable as possible, I think what you likely do is Merrill and Spurgeon, Faber and Chisholm, and then Dermott and Bogosian is probably how I would do it. But then you have Chisholm and Faber be your top pairing. Bottom line, no matter how the Wild draw this out or structure this, like I said, you are going to need to disperse 3 blocks per game that Middleton's bringing you. You're also going to need to try to evenly spread the time on ice that Middleton brings to the table. He is currently averaging over 20 minutes per night, 20 minutes, 36 seconds per night on the ice. And the other defensemen for the Minnesota Wild. So Middleton's at 20:36. Brock Faber's at 25:02. Jonas Brodin was at 22:08. Jared Spurgeon's at 20:49. Zach Bogosian's at 15:55. Declan Chisholm's at 16:56. So what I would like to see, and I know he's done this since he got paired up with Jared Spurgeon, you could probably give Declan Chisholm 23, 24 minutes. Spurgeon has been really good since he returned. Do you really want to up him to, you can up him to like 22, 21, 22 minutes a night. I don't know if I want him pushing 25, 26, 27 minutes out there. Declan Chisholm can certainly get some increased time. Zach Bogosian can certainly get some upped minutes as well. But the reality of the situation is that second and third pair are going to be played more, and that means that the opponent is going to be attacking them quite a bit and trying to take advantage of that third pairing especially. So I reiterate, this is a big loss for the Minnesota Wild. It's not a season ender. The Wild, I think, have enough equity built up that they can afford a little bit of a scuffle. The key thing here is going to be to just float through this stretch. Stay alive. Just tread some water. If the injuries continue to mount, that's when this becomes a major problem. And with Zuccarello, with Eck, with Brodin, with Middleton, all out of the lineup, that's already a big problem. And one of the other things that the Wild are going to need to do in the interim to just take pressure off of not only the D, but the PK, because Middleton was one of your big PK guys too. You're going to have to cut out the stupid penalties. Like, that's a non-starter. And evidently, John Hines was pretty fired up after the game and at practice today about the lazy penalties that have been a huge issue for this team, specifically Matt Boldy over the last 3 games. You got to cut that out. You can't have those types of things. And I think the way that gets solved is by what John Hines did in the third period. You sit Boldy for most of the night, most of that third period, to send the message. You got to send the message somehow so that players understand, if I don't pick this up, this is going to be like, this is where I am just going to be sat for large stretches. So hopefully the message was understood. Boldy is, I think, too important to this team to be scratched, but I think sitting him for a good portion of the final bit of the night probably sends enough of a message. So there are a lot of things that the Wild are going to need to fine-tune in this stretch going forward. And this is going to be a real test of this team's mettle. This will be a really good indicator of if they are a team that is different this year or a team that we kind of start to see some flashes of last year. So we'll see how it plays out, but I do not know what to expect from Travis Dermott. We'll find out in tomorrow's game against the Flyers. That'll do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.